For more than a decade, Florida law has demanded that sex trafficked minors be treated as victims, not criminals. But a new report says too often that's not the case. The Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center is releasing their findings publicly in a couple of hours. But here to give us an early look is Vicky Basra, the center's president and CEO, and one of the study's authors. Good morning, Vicky.
Good morning.
We are also joined by Stacy Ellison, the center's vice president of development and communications. Good morning, Stacy.
Thank you for having us.
So I'll just start, Stacy. First of all, thank you for releasing the report this morning on the program. The report's called See the Girl, Trafficked Behind Closed Doors. And it basically is looking at shortfalls of a 2012 law called the Florida Safe Harbor Act. Can you just remind us what that law is supposed to do?
Well, the law, with the Policy Center's advocacy efforts and partners in Tallahassee, was enacted to ensure that juveniles in our community, minors, are treated as victims, not criminals, understanding that when a young person is in the midst of commercial sexual exploitation, i.e. human trafficking, there are so many situations that they find themselves in as a result of the coercion and the violence and the situations that are being imposed on them because of their exploiters. The purpose of the Safe Harbor law was to ensure that these young people are recognized as the victims of a crime and that they are not criminalized and then burdened with resulting charges, legal fees, all of the things that result from that justice system involvement.
And so that law is designed to make sure that people that they are given resources that are appropriate for their circumstance as victims and not incarcerated and locked up and punished for behaviors that are associated with their victimization. Your report looks at whether that's happening.
Absolutely, because what we understand is that when you do incarcerate these young people, you are perpetuating the traumas in their lives. And once a young person is engaged with the justice system, I tell you what, Ann, it's a very hard cycle to extricate yourself from. And Vicky has absolute knowledge and expertise in really even the impact of this incarceration for young people.
So, Vicky, you began this report because you were hearing and also seeing in the work that you do, the hands-on work, that what was supposed to be happening was not happening. Tell us about what you were hearing and seeing and what ultimately your report has concluded.
So our team members who work in the community, work in the detention centers, work in the court systems, were coming back and letting us know that while so many girls were being arrested, there was a component of trafficking they were sharing about. While many of them didn't label it as trafficking, the stories really connected as recognizing these girls were being trafficked. And so we started digging deeper to try to understand what's really happening. Is the trafficking and the criminal activity linked, or is it two separate things? Is the trafficker coercing the young person to get involved in the criminal activity? And so we started by looking at the state studies. And what the state study shows that 1 in 3 girls who is in the criminal justice system has also been a victim of human trafficking. We then started looking at our own data, what was happening for the girls we specifically served. And we found that 53% of them had been arrested at some point. And we recognize that the law is failing. The exact people it should be protecting, it's failing them. And we wanted to understand, where is the failure? Why are we seeing this? And we found, one, that the assessment tool that we're presently using to understand whether or not girls and young people are being trafficked isn't asking the right questions. It isn't recognizing that most of the girls, most of the young people are being trafficked by somebody they know, and therefore they don't recognize it as a trafficking situation. And so we need to ask the questions differently. Second, we understand that young people are more likely to share what's happening to them with survivor advocates, so those with lived experiences, than anybody else. And so we want to really talk about, how do we engage survivor advocates in the work so that they can be part of the first response?
One of the challenges that you note in the report is that very often identifying victims, it can be more challenging because the victims don't identify themselves as victims. They don't self-identify as victims of sexual trafficking or sexual violence in some cases. Talk about the relationships that they have that are that allow them to sort of have that impression and that self-definition that perhaps somebody that recognizes sex trafficking would see differently?
So, what we learned in a prior research study we did was that most of the predators or the traffickers that get engaged with these young people, they are looking for gaps in the individual's life. So, they're looking at whether or not this person has any healthy relationships or strong relationships. They're looking at, does this person have a place to stay? Are they addicted to drugs? They take those gaps, and that's what they build their relationship on. This is not happening overnight. It usually is a 3 to 6 month period. And what they do is they show up as being very helpful. I will find you a place to live, or you can come live with me. I have a family. Come join my family so you don't feel alone, right? And we define this as predatory helpfulness.
Mhm.
And our young people whose brains aren't fully developed don't see this person as a predator. They see this person as someone being really, really helpful, who's come in and protected them like no other adult has. They build trust in the relationship. And so when the transition happens from that helpful relationship to a predatory relationship, they're made to believe that somehow it's their fault. They're made to believe that if they seek any support, nobody is going to support them. Nobody's going to believe them. By this time, it's 3 to 6 months into the relationship.
Is it usually sort of like a stair step to get to what we think of as traditional sex trafficking? I mean, are there sort of steps that they have their victims engage in that sort of ease the path? Because it does seem like it would be a difficult turn for anybody to sort of suddenly find themselves openly sex trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times it's this trusting relationship, and then, hey, we've run out of money. We need money. If you want to keep living in the hotel or the motel with me, we need money. Just do this one time. Let's just make enough money to get through this week. So there's a lot of coercion that happens that makes the individual believe that this relationship, that she's supporting the relationship. It can also be violent. So some women have talked about how the relationship was really nice, and then all of a sudden one day, the trafficker became violent. So there's multiple ways that switch happens from being a really helpful relationship to one that becomes very violent and unsafe.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to the authors of a new report that says Northeast Florida is failing young sex trafficking victims. You can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Stacy, I sort of alluded in the intro to the fact that some traffickers are using the criminal justice system, are using the juvenile justice system to exploit, to trap their victims. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Well, while I am certainly not the expert, I can tell you what I've learned as I have read our research and spoken with our professionals at work as well. And traffickers, predators, are incredibly crafty and incredibly knowledgeable of how systems work. Therefore, they are able to manipulate them. I've learned so much from Vicky, sitting with her and listening to her. And if, in fact, a young person is incarcerated, is locked up for perhaps misdemeanor charges related to their trafficking, guess who's usually coming to bail them out? It would be their trafficker.
Mm.
They understand how to work the system so that they then, to Vicky's point, are perpetuating the idea in this young person's head that this is the only person I have. This is the only person who's coming to help me. Those connections become deeper as they become more and more unsafe. And it's something that as a community, we must recognize how these cycles happen so that we are able, as a community, to enact the policies and procedures that break those cycles and those unhealthy connections.
In terms of cycles, you were talking about different coercive methods, Vicky. One of the things that the report talks about that is just especially distressing is the idea that very often victims are threatened with the exploitation of their children if they don't consent or if they don't participate in sex trafficking. That more than 20% of the people that you serve say that was a threat that was made to them, that their children would be trafficked if they didn't do it themselves.
Absolutely. The trafficker is using multiple factors to coerce, whether it's addiction, whether it's their children, whether it's that I'm going to tell your family, I'm going to tell them what you're doing. Their whole relationship is built on threat and fear. And so when I'm living in a space of threat and fear, a person can make me do whatever they want me to do, especially if they threaten my children.
So one of the things that traffickers can use if somebody has begun participating, whether it's to help with the rent or, to pay for a bill, if they've engaged in that once, is to shame them. The fact that they've become this thing, this other person by their behavior. And so shame is a big part of it. And I'm curious what relationship the policy center has to sort of, I guess you'd call it kind of more positive sex worker philosophies. And whether, I mean, you obviously are dealing, and these laws we're talking about are with minors who are unable to consent to sex trafficking. I mean, that's the law says, and that's agreed upon. But is it difficult? Are messages getting mixed when people are trying to also create safe spaces for, what they define as sex workers as opposed to people who are being exploited by sex trafficking?
So I get asked this question often, and I always start by saying no girl wakes up at the age of 10, 12, thinking one day I want to grow up and this is what I want to do. And so whether we legalize it or don't, I think the question comes back to, is it a real choice to be engaged in this, whether it's professional sex work or whether it's being trafficked? Because I believe that if women had more choices and opportunities to make similar amounts of money, if there were less barriers for women who've been in the criminal justice system to attain jobs where they could get a true living wage, then there's concept of choice, right? But when there's no real choice, then I think the question we ask is really a mute question, because we're talking about an occupation that nobody grows up in school saying they want to be part of.
Sure, and I think of no parent wishes that for their child, and so that does seem like at least in the early days of a universal belief. What are some of the recommendations, Stacy, that the report is making here in terms of things like the assessment tools? Or Vicky, I don't know if that's something you'd rather address.
Absolutely. So, as I shared earlier, definitely taking a look at our assessment tool, seeing are we asking the right questions to really understand what's happening in this young person's life, right? What actually happened to even get them to a point that they're now have been coerced into the relationship, understanding the relationship. Second is really involving survivor advocates in the work. We know they can do this work better than any one of us can. Girls tell me all the time, Miss Vicky, I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to someone who gets it, who understands what I've been through, who can speak the way, I understand them and they understand me. I think we also need to implement more formal insight over what is happening. So when we see these young people incarcerated in front of judges, are we asking the right questions? And that goes back to also making sure we're gathering the data.
Mhm.
So while we have data on the girls we're serving, we believe we need to be doing a statewide study to really understand what's happening at the state level. We can tell you what's happening here in Duval County, but better understanding the state level and then training. Our first responders need training so that when they see certain things, they can recognize what's happening. They can understand what questions they need to be asking, and what to do when a young person in front of them identifies as being trafficked.
Well, you talk about involving survivors in the process, and the report gets pretty specific about some ideas on that front, including whether if there's a call that comes in to 911 or to a first responder in an emergency situation that involves a minor, that you would like to see it, if not routine, at least somewhat more systemic, to have a survivor go with first responders. I'm curious what kind of response you get on that suggestion from people, from law enforcement, for instance, because it seems like that could be controversial, complicated.
We actually have a great relationship with the sheriff's department here, and they do utilize our survivor mentors. So, if a young person comes in, they are the first ones to call our crisis line, and our team goes out and works with them. So, we have a great relationship. I think it's a model that works great in Jacksonville, and I think other communities need to do it more often.
Yeah.
You kind of have to remember that in those situations, often the interactions that these young people have had with law enforcement has not been positive. And so when we're thinking about that, it's really about the concept of trust, that someone is alongside this interaction with law enforcement who is my advocate. And that's almost how it's seen at the beginning. This is someone who's here for me,
Hmm.
not to punish and not to be punitive, but to be my advocate, even at this first touch. And it can truly change the outcome of a situation from the beginning.
But that again, relies on law enforcement seeing this person as a victim. So if you're responding to a scene and a young woman has attacked someone or has shoplifted or has stolen someone's credit cards and used them, you are asking the law enforcement individual, the officer, to view them differently and to kind of allow this person who is a survivor advocate come in and start talking to the person that they are perhaps wanting to interview for criminal
Hmm.
purposes. And so
Hmm.
that must be difficult to change the mindset or to persuade law enforcement that that's an appropriate way to approach a crime scene, right?
That's right. And I mean, it's law enforcement, it's our community as a whole, right? Because we are trained to look at behaviors and address behaviors. But at the core of the policy center's work, it's about, okay, we see the behavior, but let's see what contributed
Mhm.
to this particular moment. What are the contributing factors that led this young person to do the things that you just spoke of? And so it's really about that level of mindfulness and thinking much more deeply about the situations and the issues that contributed to a behavior as opposed to specifically addressing the behavior itself.
Is there a response line for people who are in this circumstance to reach out to, whether in Northeast Florida or anywhere in the state, if they're listening or if they're experiencing something like this?
There are multiple lines. There's national lines and local lines. I know the state recently created a helpline as well. You can visit our website at seethegirl.org, and all of those numbers are listed there.
Yeah. And the report will also be listed there shortly at seethegirl.org. Who's this report designed for? I mean, who should be reading it?
I think everyone should be reading it because everyone brings their unique perspective and lived experience. So if you are someone who is in law enforcement or a social worker, a girl serving professional, this report will hit you differently because it's going to challenge you perhaps to adjust some of the ways that you are doing your everyday work. Um, it's going to challenge you to think about what are the trauma informed, gender responsive ways that I need to be better serving girls in our community. For those of us who are not professionals in that field, it will challenge you to think differently about the issues surrounding human trafficking. When I think so often about how many of us grew up, the songs, the movies, the overall social messaging that we received around prostitutes, who we now know as women who are trafficked and who are victims, it has shaped the way we think of not only the issue, but those who are being victimized. And reports like this help you look at those things differently. And when we talk about policy and practice reform, what we know is that change begins individually within our community. When our community changes its mind about something, that's when the policies, the practices, the votes change to the benefit.
Well, Vicky Basra, Stacy Ellison, thank you so much for coming on this morning and talking about this new report and sharing it with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having us.
Thank you.